This first study that I did, it was a huge study. It involved teacher language samples, like I just showed you a little bit of work from, encoding them for a number of things. It involved looking at the speech and reading curriculums in a number of programs and looking at what was happening in the homes. But primarily it involved testing a number of different groups of students who used all these different inputs on the same battery of literacy tests. And that battery was designed with Mary Pat Moeller from Boys Town National Research Hospital. And in it, I studied 74 deaf students who used signed English or manual English or PSE. Now, I've noticed in some of the work that I've read from Texas that you make a distinction between CASE, or conceptually accurate signed English, and PSE. It would be hard for me to even describe the differences in those two. Maybe it's real clear to you, but to me, those are basically conceptualized versions of English. And so those of you who are familiar with CASE might read PSE as CASE to you. Now the more common term is contact language. But this was back in 1988. Anyway, I compared that large number of students to, with regards to their reading and English language ability, to about 100 children who used oral English, C1, C2, and cued speech. And I was interested in what I believe to be a difference between those two groups based on complete, consistent language input. And let me just, oh, here it is. My students are so tired of me talking about CCC input that they say this will be on my grave. And I'm just, Mary Pat and I got a little wild one time. Mary Pat Moeller and I went on to have some other C's, but I'm going to only talk about these top ones. CCC input is what I use to divide these groups based on the work that I had done in hearing bilingual research and just normal language acquisition. Now, when I say normal language acquisition, I mean 3 different groups of people. Hearing monolingual users that use one language, which is what most of us think of as normal language development. It's all based on hearing kids that know English. But hearing bilingual children also have normal language development. And hearing, or children who grow up bimodally, where one parent knows sign, is a native signer, and one parent is a hearing English user, also have normal language development. So what was important in those situations was that the input was comprehensible. In other words, English, oral English, is a grammatically complete language, but it's not comprehensible to 2/3 of the deaf children. So it's not comprehensible. So that's an important factor. Being complete is an important factor, and by that I mean grammatically complete. The grammar is encoded, and that it's used consistently. Like, you know, in deaf ed we have this thing, I don't like that sign. That doesn't exist in any other language situation. You have to get together and be flexible and decide that you're going to sign the same way so that our kids have a chance to learn the language, and then later they can learn the flexibility. Now, my family, you know, we grew up in Wisconsin. We call the drinking fountain a bubbler. We've learned to adjust. It's the same in every language or system situation. You just have to decide what you're going to use so that the kids can acquire that. So those are the 3 that were particularly important in my work. And so therefore, these groups were, this group A was children who were not only exposed to oral English, but they were in oral programs, and they were children who, for whom oral English was understandable. And then the C children and the cued speech children. And then this group was the children that used signed English or manual English and pigeon signed English. Now, I don't have time this morning to go into these systems in great detail, but no matter how proficiently you signed English, it is just not designed to encode the complete grammar of English. For example, if you want to say unworkable, what you have to say is you have to shake your head, sign not, work. So when we first got Mary Patty, we were in a signed English situation, and we would want to say things like, don't unbuckle your seatbelt, and it would come out like not buckle your seatbelt, which kind of was almost like, go ahead and unbuckle it. So very quickly we decided that we were going to borrow from C2 in that situation, so that and that's another example of where the meaning isn't real clear. And then PSE, which again was never designed to be used educationally, although it's probably the most popular method of communication in our schools today. It was never designed for classroom use. It has great value as a social communication tool. But what my work showed is that children that were in those kinds of situations did not do well with regard to English reading and language ability. There was, when you looked at who was middle class or not, which is often something that's important to us in research, if there was any advantage, it was for the children who were using the incomplete sign systems. The male and female distribution was equal. And another important thing I thought in this research was that I reported both unaided audiometric information and aided. And even today in our journals, you usually see reported unaided information, even though we know that children can perform very, very differently if they have consistent and benefit from their hearing aids or their cochlear implants. So it seemed to me back there that it was time to really address that and at least give some information about their aided and unaided pure tone averages. So you can see here that there is some difference in the aided abilities of the complete group, but it's not statistically significant, and that when unaided, both groups of children were very profoundly deaf. Okay, so the major findings of that research then, and this is described in your handout on both page 6 in this 1988 publication, and then again, just the reading part was written up in a book chapter in 1990, and that's described on page 4. And out of that work became this idea that CCC input, complete, comprehensible, and consistent input, is essential. And even though I think that was one of the major findings of this research, that information is still left out in many things that you'll read today. People want to glump total communication or manually coded English research all together. And when they do that, it doesn't look very good. And that's because they put all the PSE and signed English research in with the C research, and it gets what we call confounded. It gets mixed up, so you don't really have the result that my research showed. So this idea that total communication systems should be divided out and discussed was an important finding in that work. And then finally, probably my biggest to date contribution to the research field was this calculation of sign to voice ratio. By figuring out all these sign to voice ratios, when I went in and looked at and videotaped teachers, I came up with this mathematical way to figure how well we sign compared to how well we voice. And now a lot of people use that in their work. Well, I was a teacher trainer at the time, and really I was a young teacher trainer, and most people like me weren't satisfied to know CCC input. They wanted to know, yeah, well, which one was really better though? And so I went on to do follow-up analysis of that work. And what's here on this graph is the looking when unaided and age of the children were controlled, and I'll show you how to read this. The C children here outperformed the people listed, the groups of children listed here. So the C2 children outperformed the oral English children on the passage comprehension test. See how to read that? They didn't outperform the C1 children on anything. They couldn't outperform themselves. They outperformed the signed English, manual English children on these tests. These are synonyms, you know, as you give them a word, they have to tell you a synonym. These are Woodcock-Johnson tests. Passage comprehension. The Northwest Syntax Screening Tool is set up to test children on what they know about the syntax of English. They outperformed the PSE children and they outperformed the ASL children. Now, at this time that I did my data collection, the ASL children were not using ASL in the classroom, and I think that's an important thing to comment on. They were third generation ASL users. They all went to residential schools. I used 3 different residential schools, but they weren't able to use their native language in the classroom. Is their language complete, consistent, and used consistently? Probably, but they weren't able to use it at school. So that could change the results here. What's important here, and this is, you know, then the next group that did well was the oral English group. That's why I got this publication in the Volta. And then the C1 group. What I think is really important again to note here is that never on the top of these do you see signed English or PSE. They didn't, those students never outperformed anybody. Okay, so that was the unaided, controlled for unaided, and this is controlled for aided and age. And you see basically the same pattern. The C2 students were the people that outperformed everybody the most, and then oral English and C1, and then 1 ASL test. And who did they outperform? The signed English people, children. So does that fit the CCC thing? Yes. So that research was very welcomed in a way by people who were supporters of C1 and C2, and I think it gave us a place as responsible professionals to at least guide parents to, there's still a lot of choices that you can pick, but a choice possibly to avoid would be signed English or PSE, in other words, conceptual signed English. Now, one of the things that for 2 or 3 years now I have abandoned my C2 research and been focusing on essential practices of literacy skills. But one of the things that brought me back to deciding that it was time to conduct some current research was an article that I have here for any of those of you who are interested, that was done by Judith Correll, spelled C-O-R-Y-E-L-L, and Thomas Holcomb, who it's my understanding was raised on C2. And they published this article in the Journal of Speech and Hearing Disorders, which is the most prominent journal for speech and language pathologists. And when you are a speech and language pathologist, you need to belong to ASHA, their national organization, and by membership you then get this journal. And this article attempted to, or it was designed to look like it was looking at all the languages or systems and giving us information about how they were constructed and what were some of the pros and cons about using them. And I know this looks really messy, but I wanted to just point out something to you in just one section of this article. Although recently I was out in San Jose and I went through the whole article with Geraldine's master's students and showed them how deceptively written this article is. Mostly because, like the famed Unlocking the Curriculum piece that sort of launched the bye-bye movement, they left out a lot of research that didn't agree with the points they were trying to make. And so one example of that is down here, which between this overhead and this overhead projector is going to be interesting, but I'll start right here and I'll just move it around. So now they're talking about, they've mentioned a few reasons why you might want to sign manually coded English, and now they're going to talk about some areas of concern. So the first thing to notice here is they're talking about manually coded English. They've already lumped all these systems together. And they say, manually coded English systems have received much criticism from educators. And then the people that they list are all people, and now some of you I know won't know these people, but those of you who know them, you would have no hesitation at thinking why they would criticize manually coded English. These people are some of the most, the strongest ASL proponents in the United States today. Bob Hoffmeister, Johnson, Liddell, and Erding are the people who wrote Unlocking the Curriculum. Sam Sapala is a deaf man who is a very strong advocate of ASL. He claims to have done his master's about C in Illinois. I lived in Illinois during that time. There was no C and still is no C in Illinois. And it was always interesting to me that he would keep saying that because, I mean, I lived there and I worked with the schools quite closely, and I just knew that there was no C there. He had no videotape, and yet here's my work not being published in the American Annals of the Deaf for political reasons, and he's, you know, a touted speaker all over the country. So obviously this group of people are not going to be strong supporters of C2. Okay, manually coded systems seem to be overly complex, difficult to process cognitively. That means, you know, when you're thinking, it's an overload, and often lacking in the expressive nature contained in the inflections of ASL. Now, what that really means is the manual features of any sign language. And that's why our instructors work so hard with us during these workshops to use the manual features of any signed language. You know what those are, you know, directionality and emphasis and eye gaze, the things that we've been studying this week. Because C is often criticized for not including those, as you've probably been told this week. However, if you look in the 1972 paperback edition of the C2 dictionary, it's only like about this thick, you will see that Esther and Gerald Lee were they were, as far as I know, the first people to encourage users of C2 to use manual features in using C2. So this comment comes up over and over again. Those features are referred to as manual features of ASL or ASL features over and over again. But it's just a fallacy. It's not true. Additionally, manually coded systems are not used by any linguistic community and thus do not have any native language models. And, you know, again, you have to just think, well, these sign systems were invented in about 1972. That means that a number of these kids have now grown up. We've been told even at this workshop that a number of them are teachers. So there must be a community now of people that use C2. And so you have to just kind of use common sense sometimes. A major concern is the inability of manually coded English systems to accurately represent spoken English. Now, didn't I just tell you about that? And I told you there was probably 10 studies now that show that it does. And notice, you know how research is written? You say something, and then you back it up by all the research. You notice how there's no research backing that up there?